any one time, there are hundreds of thousands of containers floating across the Pacific. And sometimes we are not sure when the containers arrive what the tariff rates would be. So for the business world, the trade tension has created enormous confusion and anxiety. And there's very significant trade and investment diversion. So countries like Vietnam are benefiting hugely. In fact, the whole of Southeast Asia is benefiting from the Sino-US conflict. So too parts of South Asia, like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Africa too is benefiting. But if the two clash, it is not good for the world. And this trade conflict may well hasten the arrival of another global financial crisis. We don't know. When these things happen, they happen. And they happen sometimes from the most unexpected corner. But what is much more serious is not the trade conflict. Much more serious is the political conflict. Because the US now worries whether China poses a significant security threat to the US. The US is free after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's used to operating freely everywhere in the world. It has its battle groups in the Gulf, in the Baltics, in the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, in the South China Sea, everywhere. In the air, on land, surface, underwater. And now everywhere in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific, they meet the Chinese. Underwater, on land, in the air, in outer space. And they are now not so sure if there is a clash in the South China Sea. They are not sure that they will prevail over the Chinese. And the Chinese are sending signals. We don't want a war. But don't be so sure that if there's a war, you will win. And if you followed the October 1st 70th anniversary parade in Beijing recently, the Chinese very deliberately opened a few cards, very deliberately, and for specific reasons, to signal to the US that in their strategic thinking, do not be too sure that over the South China Sea, over Taiwan, that you will win. And that is the question mark the Chinese want to put in the minds of US strategic thinkers. The US doesn't like this because it is not used to this. And they're going after companies like Huawei. The reasons they give are not the real reasons. If you follow Edward Snowden and why he blew the whistle, because they were creating an incredible system called PRISM, which enabled them even to listen to Chancellor Merkel's private conversation on her mobile phone. As Huawei expands, as the Chinese becomes significant in the 5G world, the ability of US NSA to penetrate international information systems becomes more difficult. And they are now feeling that that China has been benefiting from US openness. The large numbers of Chinese students who study in the US, the professors who teach in the US, that they have been siphoning knowledge to China. The FBI is now obsessed with this. And in top universities in the US, they have asked for a listing of ethnic Chinese scientists. Ethnic Chinese scientists. In other words, not only PRC passport holders, but also Hong Kong Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese, even Singapore Chinese. Christopher Wray, the director at FBI, in his testimony to Congress, he said, China's efforts in taking intellectual property from the US is not all of government. He said it is all of society. All of society. And the American response must also be all of society. Now, this is very close to ethnic profiling. But the US is in such a frame of mind now. And even recently, when Houston Rockets manager in the tweet supported Hong Kong democracy, there was a furious response in China. And then the manager removed the tweet, apologized, but his apology in Chinese was much more fulsome than his apology in English, and this was noticed by the Chinese. And now the politicians are jumping in and said, why are you apologizing? Why are you being intimidated by the Chinese? So big hoo-ha. This is now the phase of history we are entering, where Sino-US conflict will be extended for years to come, maybe even decades to come. And many of us may be caught in between. It is much more important than trade conflict. How will it end? It can end in war. I hope not, because war between China and the US will be devastating for the entire world. But it may lead to proxy wars, proxy conflicts in various parts of the world. I don't believe that China is expansionist, because in Chinese history, the leaders of China, their preoccupations are domestic, because it is a huge country, and managing a country of that size is not easy. When they are organized, the productivity is awesome. But when they dissolve into conflict, the conflicts are also awesome. And that's why you have these long cycles in Chinese history. What we are seeing today is a continuing rise of China. It will continue for another 10, 20, 30 years. But after that, China is aging. And this will have an impact on the economy. But in the meantime, as China adds 2 Saudi Arabias to its economy every year, it will benefit its neighbors more and more. In July this year, McKinsey produced a report with a simple conclusion, but a profound conclusion. It is that the world's exposure to China is growing, because the Chinese economy is growing rapidly. But China's exposure to the rest of the world is reducing. The world's exposure to China is growing, but China's exposure to the rest of the world is reducing. And the reason is because the growth of the Chinese economy is increasingly driven by its internal economy, not by its external economy. But because of its size, because of its market, in the years ahead, China will be a more important market for many countries, and even for US companies. China may be a more important market than the US market. And throughout Chinese history, they've been averse to sending military forces far away. You know, in the 8th century, at the peak of China's development during the Tang Dynasty, they had an army in the Fergana Valley in Central Asia. And the Abbasids were moving eastwards. And they clashed. In the famous Battle of Talas, the Abbasids defeated the Tang army, and the Chinese never crossed the Tian Shan Mountains again in their history. China's statecraft is not to use military force lightly, but to conduct diplomacy in such a way there's no need to fight. So if you are China's neighbor, and you're difficult. What do? All they do is to add a little friction to the trade, just a little friction. You will feel it because your economy is much smaller than China. China will just reduce friction for the other countries. It has no impact on China, but it has an excruciating impact on you. In the same way, if China wants to favor a particular country, all it needs to do is to reduce friction for that country. And that country will be delirious. But again, the cost to China is minimal because all it needs to do is to tighten up a little all around and to feed the country. This has been Chinese statecraft, practiced statecraft, for a very long time. So in some respects, China's behavior is predictable. But many countries don't believe this. They say, no, all this is just talk. Well, we'll see. Both sides have to prepare for war. I don't think it will happen because it will be too disastrous. There will be trials of strength. And this has enormous implications for the rest of us. In the Middle East, in recent years, the entanglement is with the Western powers. I remember having a conversation with the previous Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Hamad. And we were discussing the book by David Fromkin, A Peace to End All Peace. The First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was a phrase made by Wavell. But in the end, it became a peace to end all peace. Many of the problems that we see in the region today, whether it is about the Turkish problem with the Kurds, Yemen, the tension with Iran, has its roots in the period of Western dominance. But if we cast our eyes 20, 30 years ahead, China will become a factor. And if you add up the economies of Southeast Asia and South Asia, there's one more China. So the gravitational pull affecting geoeconomics and geopolitics in the region will change. And the countries in the region which anticipate these changes, which prepare for them, and which adjust to them, I think we have a great advantage. You remember in 2016, January, February, China's President Xi Jinping made a visit to Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. I followed it closely because I thought it would be quite interesting how China managed its external affairs. When he arrived in Tehran, he met the president, he met the spiritual leader, hugs and protestations of strategic friendship. Then he went to Riyadh. And again, Saudi Arabia and China protested their strategic friendship. And again in Cairo, and also the Arab League. 3 months later, the Chinese Vice Premier, Liu Yingtong, visited Israel and Palestine. And the Israelis said, never before has a relationship between Israel and China been at such a peak. And so to the Palestinians. Now, is it because the Chinese are more brilliant that they can find a way to solve the equations which other countries cannot solve? No. It's because they have a very different view of statecraft from Western powers. And their approach is, I have enough problems of my own, I have enough headaches of my own. If we can work together, help one another, let's do that, let's be friends. Your problems, well, good luck to you. If I can help you, I'll help you, but they're your problems, they're not mine. There's no attempt to convert you to their system. There's no attempt to have a preference that Arab societies or Iranian society or Muslim society should be organized in one way or another. And this is the import of the Belt and Road. The Americans are very unhappy about this because they see the connections which China is building to be reducing their power and influence in those countries. But for China, this is nothing new because when the water tower goes up, by which I'm referring to the Chinese economy, it is natural that the water will flow down. It will not flow down in a straight line. Sometimes it meets a mountain, sometimes it meets a canyon. So it follows the lay of the land. And countries which welcome the China trade will get more of it. Countries which are opposed to the China trade will find it flowing around them. And after a while they said, oh, that's not good for me because my neighbors are benefiting more than me. And so they make their adjustments. We see all this in Southeast Asia because China has complex relations with Vietnam, with Myanmar, with Laos, with Bangladesh, with India, with Pakistan. And countries which oppose the Belt and Road, the Chinese response is, well, it's up to you. But in the meantime, we will work with your neighbors. And then gradually, they erode your position. I remember a startling comment made to me by a Kazakh minister about 4 years ago. We were having dinner in Singapore and he said, you know, the Chinese are talking about building a tunnel below the Straits of Hormuz to connect Iran to the peninsula. I said, really? Well, of course, from the viewpoint of engineering, it is nothing to the Chinese. From the viewpoint of politics, it seems unimaginable today. Unimaginable today. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, is it possible? We don't know. It depends on how the politics change. We are small countries, Oman and Singapore. We cannot change the world. We accept the world for what it is. I had the pleasure of a reunion with the minister responsible for foreign affairs, Yusuf Alawi, yesterday. I've always appreciated his wisdom because when I speak to him, he gives me a clinical view of politics in the region. There's no subjectivity. There's no preference for one course of action or the other. It is the world as it is. Kissinger, in his book, he said, Singapore has a cold-blooded view of the world. As a small country, as small countries, we cannot afford to be subjective. If we are subjective, we are dead. You are remarkable people with a long history, with a seafaring tradition. You can't change the weather. When there's a cyclone, there's a cyclone. You've got to accept it. When you build your boats, well, they've got to take all this into account. You have to be utterly realistic. So when my last visit in Oman, 2006, we had just acquired an old wreck south of Singapore, an Arab dhow carrying a treasure of Chinese porcelains intended for the Middle East, because half the porcelains had Islamic motifs. So the wreck was well preserved because sand covered it. So when I passed by the circus outside this hotel, I saw the Sinbad ship, the Sohar. And I asked Said Badr, who was sitting next to me, I said, would you be able to rebuild this 9th century wreck that we bought? I didn't have the money, neither did I have the intention, but I was just curious. He said, yes, of course. We have this shipbuilding tradition in Seoul. I'm sure they can do it. I didn't ask him how much it would cost because I didn't have the money. 3 months later, to my astonishment, he told me that Sultan Qaboos will rebuild the ship, sail it to Singapore, and donate it as his gift to the people of Singapore. Mind you, this is not the Sinbad ship. This is a 9th century ship. They had to do DNA analysis on the wood, and they found that the wood was mostly from Africa, except for the teak, which came from the Malabar coast. And it had the square stitching pattern, which is still the stitching pattern used in Seoul today. So when the research came in, I said, yes, that dhow came from the Omani coast. And when he finally set sail, I suddenly felt very worried because what if the boat were to sink? So I told my wife, I said, we better pray. So we knelt down and we prayed for the safety of the boat. About 2 weeks later, they reported a green turtle alongside. They had reached the Lakshadweep Island, the continental shelf. So we knew it was safe. Cochin, then Colombo. In Colombo, they had to repair the mast, so they chopped down 2 thick trees and built new masts. But when the boat crossed the Bay of Bengal, it met a cyclone, and the waves were 30 feet high. And they told me later that they thought they were going to die. When they reached Penang, there was a sigh of relief. And when they arrived in Singapore, I went out to sea to meet them, and I think one of the distinguished guests here were there too. Captain Saleh did not know that we had arranged for his son to be in Singapore. So prayers of thanksgiving were said, the Omani dancing, and we had a wonderful party that night. Why did Sultan Qaboos make this effort? I think he knew that the China trade will become more important in the coming years. And between Oman and Singapore, we are seafaring people, utterly realistic, adjusting with the flow and ebb of international trade and international politics. This friendship which we have, it's not a major friendship, but it's a quiet, unspoken, and a friendship which, in critical moments, can only become more important. It's in this spirit that I speak to you today and wish you a future which anticipates the re-emergence of Asia on the global stage. A replay of history which the Omani people have seen many times before in your history and which you will again respond to. Thank you.